It's footage of the Woolsey fire near Los Angeles. And the title of this piece is Life on a Shrinking Planet by Bill McKibben. 30 years ago, this magazine published, quote, The End of Nature, a long article about what we then called the greenhouse effect. 30 years ago. I was in my 20s when I wrote it, and out on an intellectual limb. Climate science was still young. But the data were persuasive and freighted with sadness. We were spewing so much carbon into the atmosphere that nature was no longer a force beyond our influence. And humanity, with its capacity for industry and heedlessness, had come to affect every cubic meter of the planet's air, every inch of its surface, every drop of its water. Scientists underlined this notion a decade later when they began referring to our era as the Anthropocene, a world made by man. I was frightened by my reporting, but at the time it seemed likely that we'd try as a society to prevent the worst from happening. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, running for president, promised that he would fight, quote, the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. He did not, nor did his successors, nor did their peers in seats of power around the world. And so in the intervening decades, what was a theoretical threat has become a fierce daily reality. As this essay goes to press, California is ablaze. A big fire near Los Angeles forced the evacuation of Malibu, and an even larger fire in the Sierra Nevada foothills has become the most destructive in California's history. After a summer of unprecedented high temperatures and a fall rainy season with less than half the usual precipitation, the northern firestorm turned a city called Paradise into an inferno within an hour, razing more than 10,000 buildings and killing at least 63 people. More than 600 others are missing. Well, that number's dropped. This is from last week's New Yorker. Bill McKibben, who 30 years ago in this magazine wrote a piece called The End of Nature, has written a piece in this week's, 30 years later, called Life on a Shrinking Planet, and we're reading from that. He says here that more than 600 others are missing. That number has come down. But his point is still well taken. As this essay goes to press, California is ablaze. A big fire near Los Angeles forced the evacuation of Malibu, and an even larger fire in the Sierra Nevada foothills has become the most destructive in California's history. Okay, the authorities brought in cadaver dogs, a lab to match evacuees' DNA with swabs taken from the dead, and anthropologists from California State University at Chico to advise on how to identify bodies from charred bone fragments. For the past few years, a tide of optimistic thinking has held that conditions for human beings around the globe have been improving. Wars are scarcer, poverty and hunger are less severe, and there are better prospects for wide-scale literacy and education. But there are newer signs that human progress has begun to flag. In the face of our environmental deterioration, it's now reasonable to ask whether the human game has begun to falter, perhaps even to play itself out. Late in 2017, a United Nations agency announced that the number of chronically malnourished people in the world after a decade of decline had started to grow again by 38 million to a total of 815 million, quote, largely due to the proliferation of violent conflicts and climate-related shocks. In June 2018, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN found that child labor, after years of falling, was growing, quote, driven in part by an increase in conflicts and climate-induced disasters, close quote. In 2015, at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris, the world's governments, noting that the Earth has so far warmed a little more than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, set a goal of holding the increase this century to 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, with a fallback target of 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This past October, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a special report stating that the global warming, quote, is likely to reach 1.5 centigrade between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate, close quote. We will have drawn a line in the sand and then watched a rising tide erase it. The report did not mention that in Paris, countries' initial pledges would cut emissions only enough to limit warming to 3.5 degrees Celsius, about 6.3 Fahrenheit. By the end of the century, a scale and pace of change so profound as to call into question whether our current societies would survive it. Scientists have warned for decades that climate change would lead to extreme weather. Shortly before the IPCC report was published, Hurricane Michael, the strongest hurricane ever to hit the Florida Panhandle, inflicted $30 billion worth of material damage and killed 45 people. President Trump, who has argued that global warming is, quote, a total and very expensive hoax, close quote, visited Florida to survey the wreckage, but told reporters that the storm had not caused him to rethink his decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords. He expressed no interest in the IPCC report beyond asking, quote, who drew it? The answer is 91 researchers from 40 countries. He later claimed that his natural instinct for science made him confident that the climate would soon change back. A month later, Trump blamed the fires in California on gross mismanagement of forests. Human beings have always experienced wars and truces, crashes and recoveries, famines, and terrorism. We've endured tyrants and outlasted perverse ideologies. Climate change is different. As a team of scientists recently pointed out in the journal Nature Climate Change, the physical shifts we're inflicting on the planet will, quote, extend longer than the entire history of human civilization thus far. Close quote. The poorest and most vulnerable will pay the highest price. But already, even in the most affluent areas, many of us hesitate to walk across a grassy meadow because of the proliferation of ticks bearing Lyme disease, which have come with the hot weather. We have found ourselves unable to swim off beaches because jellyfish, which thrive as warming seas kill off other marine life, have taken over the water. The planet's diameter will remain 8,000 miles, and its surface will still cover 200 million square miles. But the Earth, for humans, has begun to shrink under our feet and in our minds. Climate change, like urban sprawl or gun violence, has become such a familiar term that we tend to read past it. But exactly what we've been up to should fill us with awe. During the past 200 years, we have burned immense quantities of coal and gas and oil in car motors, basement furnaces, power plants, steel mills. And as we have done so, carbon atoms have combined with oxygen atoms in the air to produce carbon dioxide. This, along with other gases like methane, has trapped heat that would otherwise have radiated back out to space. There are at least 4 other episodes in the Earth's half-billion-year history of animal life when CO2 has poured into the atmosphere in greater volumes, but perhaps never at greater speeds. Even at the end of the Permian Age, when huge injections of CO2 from volcanoes burning through coal deposits culminated in the Great Dying, the CO2 content of the atmosphere grew at perhaps 1/10 of the current pace. 1/10. 2 centuries ago, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 275 parts per million. It has now topped 400 parts per million and is rising more than 2 parts per million each year. The extra heat that we trap near the planet every day is equivalent to the heat from 400,000 bombs the size of the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. As a result, in the past 30 years, we've seen all 20 of the hottest years ever recorded. The melting of ice caps and glaciers and the rising levels of our oceans and seas, initially predicted for the end of the century, have occurred decades early. Quote, I've never been at a climate conference where people say, that happened slower than I thought it would, close quote. Christina Hulbe, a New Zealand climatologist, told a reporter for Grist last year. This past May, a team of scientists from the University of Illinois reported that there was a 35% chance that because of unexpectedly high economic growth rates, the UN's worst case scenario for global warming was too optimistic. Quote, "We are now truly in uncharted territory," close quote. David Carlson, the former director of the World Meteorological Organization's Climate Research Division, said in the spring of 2017, after data showed that the previous year had broken global heat records. We are off the literal charts as well. In August, I visited Greenland, where one day, with a small group of scientists and activists, I took a boat from the village of Narsak to a glacier on a nearby fjord. As we made our way across a broad bay, I glanced up at the electronic chart above the captain's wheel, where a blinking icon showed that we were a mile inland. The captain explained that the chart was from 5 years ago, when the water around us was still ice. The American glaciologist Jason Box, who organized the trip, chose our landing site. Quote, "We called this place the Eagle Glacier because of its shape," he said. "The name, too, was 5 years old. The head and the wings of the bird have melted away. I don't know what we should call it now, but the eagle is dead." Close quote. There were two poets among the crew, Aka Niviana, who is Greenlandic, and Kathy Yetnil Kitchener from the low-lying Marshall Islands in the Pacific, where king tides recently washed through living rooms and unearthed graveyards. A small lens of fresh water has supported life on the Marshall Islands atolls for millennia, but as saltwater intrudes, breadfruit trees and banana palms wilt and die. As the Greenlandic ice we are gazing at continues to melt, the water will drown Yetnil Kitchener's homeland. About a third of the carbon responsible for these changes has come from the United States. A few days after the boat trip, the two poets and I accompanied the scientists to another fjord, where they needed to change the memory card on a camera that tracks the retreat of the ice sheet. As we took off for the flight home over the snout of a giant glacier, an 8-story chunk calved off the face and crashed into the ocean. I'd never seen anything quite like it for sheer power. The waves rose 20 feet as it plunged into the dark water. You could imagine the same waves washing through the marshes. You could almost sense the ice elevating the ocean by a sliver, along the seafront in Mumbai, which already floods on a stormy day, and at the Battery in Manhattan, where the seawall rises just a few feet above the water. When I say the world has begun to shrink, this is what I mean. Until now, human beings have been spreading from our beginnings in Africa out across the globe, slowly at first and then much faster. But a period of contraction is setting in as we lose parts of the habitable earth. Sometimes our retreat will be hasty and violent. The effort to evacuate the blazing California towns along narrow roads was so chaotic that many people died in their cars. But most of the pullback will be slower, starting along the world's coastlines. Each year, another 24,000 people abandon Vietnam's sublimely fertile Mekong Delta as crop fields are polluted with salt. As sea ice melts along the Alaskan coast, there's nothing to protect towns, cities, and native villages from the waves. In Mexico Beach, Florida, which was all but eradicated by Hurricane Michael, a resident told the Washington Post, quote, "The older people can't rebuild. It's too late in their lives. Who is going to be left? Who is going to care?" End quote. In 1 week at the end of last year, I read accounts from Louisiana where government officials were finalizing a plan to relocate thousands of people threatened by the rising Gulf. Quote, "Not everybody is going to live where they are now and continue their way of life, and that is a terrible and emotional reality to face," one state official said. From Hawaii, where according to a new study, 38 miles of coastal roads will become impassable in the next few decades, and from Jakarta, a city with population of 10 million, where a rising Java Sea has flooded the streets. In the first days of 2018, a nor'easter flooded downtown Boston. Dumpsters and cars floated through the financial district. Quote, "If anyone wants to question global warming, just see where the flood zones are," Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston, told reporters. Some of those zones did not flood 30 years ago. According to a study from the United Kingdom's National Oceanography Center last summer, the damage caused by rising sea levels will cost the world as much as $14 trillion a year by 2100 if the UN targets aren't met. $14 trillion a year by 2100 if the UN targets aren't met. Quote, like it or not, we will retreat from most of the world's non-urban shorelines in the not very distant future. Oren Pilkey, an expert on sea levels at Duke University, wrote in his book, Retreat from a Rising Sea, we can plan now and retreat in a strategic and calculated fashion, or we can worry about it later and retreat in tactical disarray in response to devastating storms. In other words, we can walk away methodically, or we can flee in panic, close quote. Man, when I think about Houston last year. But it's not clear where to go. As with the rising seas, rising temperatures have begun to narrow the margins of our inhabitation, this time in the hot continental interiors. 9 of the 10 deadliest heat waves in human history have occurred since 2000. In India, the rise in temperature since 1960, about 1 degree Fahrenheit, has increased the chance of mass heat-related deaths by 150%. The summer of 2018 was the hottest ever measured in certain areas. For a couple of days in June, temperatures in cities in Pakistan and Iran peaked at slightly above 129 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest reliably recorded temperatures ever measured. The same heat wave nearer the shore of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman combined triple-digit temperatures with soaring humidity levels to produce a heat index of more than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. June 26th was the warmest night in history, with the mercury in one Omani city remaining above 109 degrees Fahrenheit until morning. So throughout the night, 109. In July, a heat wave in Montreal killed more than 70 people, and Death Valley, which often sets American records, registered the hottest month ever seen on our planet. Africa recorded its highest temperature in June, the Korean Peninsula in July, and Europe in August. The Times reported that in Algeria, employees at a petroleum plant walked off the job as the temperature neared 124 degrees Fahrenheit. We couldn't keep up, one worker told the reporter. It was impossible to do the work. This was no illusion. Some of the world is becoming too hot for humans. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, increased heat and humidity have reduced the amount of work people can do outdoors by 10%, a figure that is predicted to double by 2050. About a decade ago, Australian and American researchers, setting out to determine the highest survivable so-called wet bulb temperature, concluded that when temperatures passed 35 Celsius, that's 95 Fahrenheit, and the humidity was higher than 90%, even in well-ventilated, shaded conditions, sweating slows down, and humans can survive only for a few hours, the exact length of time being determined by individual physiology. As the planet warms, a crescent-shaped area encompassing parts of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the North China Plain, where about 1.5 billion people, that's a fifth of humanity, live, is at high risk of such temperatures in the next half-century. Across this belt, extreme heat waves that currently happen once every generation could, by the end of the century, become annual events with temperatures close to the threshold for several weeks each year, which could lead to famine and mass migration. By 2070, tropical regions that now get 1 day of truly oppressive humid heat a year can expect between 102 and 150 days. Between 100 and 250 days, if the current levels of greenhouse gas emissions continue. According to Radley Horton, a climate scientist at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, most people would run into terrible problems before then. The effects, he added, will be transformative for all areas of human endeavor: economy, agriculture, military, recreation. Humans share the planet with many other creatures, of course. We have already managed to kill off 60% of the world's wildlife since 1970 by destroying their habitats, and now higher temperatures are starting to take their toll. A new study found that peak-dwelling birds were going extinct. As temperatures climb, the birds can no longer find relief on higher terrain. Coral reefs, rich in biodiversity, may soon be a tenth of their current size. As some people flee humidity and rising sea levels, others will be forced to relocate in order to find enough water to survive. In late 2017, a study led by Manoj Joshi of the University of Anglia found that by 2050, if temperatures rise by 2 degrees, a quarter of the Earth will experience serious drought and desertification. The early signs are clear. Sao Paulo came within days of running out of water last year, as did Cape Town this spring. In the fall, a record drought in Germany lowered the level of the Elbe to below 20 inches and reduced the corn harvest by 40%. The Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research concluded in a recent study that as the number of days that reach 86 degrees Fahrenheit or higher increases, corn and soybean yields across the U.S. grain belt could fall by between 22 and 49%. We've already overpumped the aquifers that lie beneath most of the world's bread baskets. Without the means to irrigate, we may encounter a repeat of the 1930s, when droughts and deep plowing led to the Dust Bowl, this time with no way of fixing the problem. Back then, the Okies fled to California, but California is no longer a green oasis. 100 million trees died in the record drought that gripped the Golden State for much of this decade. The dead limbs helped spread the waves of fire, as scientists earlier this year warned that they could. 30 years ago, some believed that warmer temperatures would expand the field of play, turning the Arctic into the new Midwest. As Rex Tillerson, then the CEO of Exxon, cheerfully put it in 2012, quote, "Changes to weather patterns that move crop production areas around will adapt to that." Close quote. But there is no rich topsoil in the far north. Instead, the ground is underlaid with permafrost, which can be found beneath a fifth of the northern hemisphere. As the permafrost melts, it releases more carbon into the atmosphere. The thawing layer cracks roads, tilts houses, and uproots trees to create what scientists call drunken forests. 90 scientists who released a joint report in 2017 concluded that economic losses from a warming Arctic could approach $90 trillion in the course of the century, considerably outweighing whatever savings may have resulted from shorter shipping routes as the Northwest Passage unfreezes. Churchill, Manitoba, on the edge of the Hudson Bay in Canada, is connected to the rest of the country by a single rail line. In the spring of 2017, record floods washed away much of the track. Omnitrax, which owns the line, tried to cancel its contract with the government, declaring what lawyers call a force majeure, an unforeseen event beyond its responsibility. Quote, "To fix things in this area of climate change, in this era of climate change, well, it's fixed, but you don't count on it being fixed forever," an engineer for the company explained at a media briefing in July. This summer, the Canadian government reopened the rail at a cost of $117 million, about $190,000 per Churchill resident. There's no reason to think the fix will last, and every reason to believe that our world will keep contracting. This is an 8-page piece in The New Yorker written by Bill McKibben 30 years after he wrote about climate change in this exact same magazine. So we're not going to take a music break. We're just going to keep reading because I want to cut it as one piece and put it on the net. All this has played out more or less as scientists warned, albeit faster. What has defied expectations is the slowness of the response. The climatologist James Hansen testified before Congress about the dangers of human-caused climate change 30 years ago. Since then, carbon emissions have increased with each year, except 2009, the height of the global recession. And the newest data show that 2018 will set another record. Simple inertia and the human tendency to prioritize short-term gains have played a role, but the fossil fuel industry's contribution has been by far the most damaging. Alex Steffen, an environmental writer, coined the term predatory delay to describe, quote, "the blocking or slowing of needed change in order to make money off unsustainable, unjust systems in the meantime." The behavior of the oil companies, which have pulled off perhaps the most consequential deception in mankind's history, is a prime example. As journalists at Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times have revealed since 2015, Exxon, the world's largest oil company, understood that its product was contributing to climate change a decade before Hansen testified. In July 1977, James F. Black, one of Exxon's senior scientists, addressed many of the company's top leaders in New York, explaining the earliest research on the greenhouse effect. Quote, "There is general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels," he said, according to a written version of the speech, which was later recorded and which was obtained by Inside Climate News. In 1978, speaking to the company's executives, Black estimated that a doubling of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere would increase average global temperatures by between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, that's 5.4 F, and as much as 10 degrees Celsius, that's 18 degrees F, at the poles of the Earth. Exxon spent millions of dollars researching the problem. It outfitted an oil tanker, the Esso Atlantic, with CO2 detectors to measure how fast the oceans could absorb excess carbon, and hired mathematicians to build sophisticated climate models. By 1982, they had concluded that even the company's earlier estimates were probably too low. In a private corporate primer, they wrote that heading off global warming and, quote, potentially catastrophic events would, quote, require major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. That was in 1982, Exxon. An investigation by the LA Times revealed that Exxon executives took these warnings seriously. Ken Croasdale, a senior researcher for the company's Canadian subsidiary, led a team that investigated the positive and negative effects of warming on Exxon's Arctic operations. In 1991, he found that greenhouse gases were rising due to the burning of fossil fuels. Quote, "Nobody disputes this fact," he said. The following year, he wrote that, quote, "global warming can only help lower exploration and development costs in the Beaufort Sea." Drilling season in the Arctic, he correctly predicted, would increase from 2 months to as many as 5 months. At the same time, he said the rise in the sea level could threaten onshore infrastructure and create bigger waves that would damage offshore drilling structures. You see where this is going. Thawing permafrost could make the earth buckle and slide under buildings and pipelines. As a result of these findings, Exxon and other major oil companies began laying plans to move into the Arctic and started to build their new drilling platforms with higher decks to compensate for the anticipated rises in the sea level. The implications of the exposés were startling. Not only did Exxon and other companies know that scientists like Hansen were right, they used his NASA climate models to figure out how low their drilling costs in the Arctic would eventually fall. Had Exxon and its peers passed on what they knew to the public, geological history would look very different today. The problem of climate change would not be solved, but the crisis would, most likely, now be receding. In 1989, an international ban on chlorine-containing man-made chemicals that had been eroding the Earth's ozone layer went into effect. Last month, researchers reported that the ozone layer was on track to fully heal by 2060. But that was a relatively easy fight because the chemicals in question were not central to the world's economy, and the manufacturers had readily available substitutes to sell. In the case of global warming, the culprit is fossil fuel, the most lucrative commodity on Earth, and so the companies responsible took a different tack. A document uncovered by the LA Times showed that a month after Hansen's testimony in 1988, an unnamed Exxon public affairs manager issued an internal memo recommending that the company, quote, emphasize the uncertainty in the scientific data about climate change. Within a few years, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Amoco, and others had joined the Global Climate Coalition, quote, to coordinate business participation in the international policy debate, close quote, on global warming. The GCC coordinated with the National Coal Association and the American Petroleum Institute on a campaign via letters and telephone calls to prevent attacks on fossil fuels, and produced a video in which the agency insisted that more carbon dioxide would, quote, end world hunger by promoting plant growth. With such efforts, it ginned up opposition to the Kyoto Protocol, the first global initiative to address climate change. In October 1997, 2 months before the Kyoto meeting, Lee Raymond, Exxon's president and CEO, who had overseen the... In October 1997, 2 months before the Kyoto meeting, Lee Raymond, Exxon's president and CEO, who had overseen Science Department that in the 1980s produced the findings about climate change, gave a speech in Beijing to the World Petroleum Congress in which he maintained that the Earth was actually cooling. The idea that cutting fossil fuel emissions could have an effect on the climate, he said, defied common sense. Quote, "It is highly unlikely that the temperature in the middle of the next century will be affected whether policies are enacted now or 20 years from now." He went on. Exxon's own scientists had already shown each of these premises to be wrong. On a December morning in 1997, at the Kyoto Convention Center, after a long night of negotiation, the developed nations reached a tentative accord on climate change. Exhausted delegates lay slumped on couches in the corridor or on the floor in their suits, but most of them were grinning. Imperfect and limited though the agreement was, it seemed that momentum had gathered behind fighting climate change. But as I watched the delegates cheering and clapping, an American lobbyist who had been coordinating much of the opposition to the accord turned to me and said, quote, "I can't wait to get back to Washington where we've got this under control." Close quote. He was right. On January 29th, 2001, 9 days after George W. Bush was inaugurated, Lee Raymond visited his old friend, Vice President Dick Cheney, who had just stepped down as the CEO of the oil drilling giant Halliburton. Cheney helped persuade Bush to abandon his campaign promise to treat carbon dioxide as a pollutant. Within the year, Frank Luntz, a Republican consultant for Bush, had produced an internal memo that made a doctrine of the strategy that the GCC had hit on a decade earlier. Quote, "Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community," Luntz wrote in the memo, which was obtained by the Environmental Working Group, a Washington-based organization. Quote, "Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate," close quote. The strategy of muddling the public's impression of climate science has proved to be highly effective. In 2017, polls found that almost 90% of Americans did not know that there was a scientific consensus on global warming. Did you hear that? Last year, 2017, polls found that almost 90% of Americans did not know that there was a scientific consensus on global warming. Raymond retired in 2006 after the company posted the biggest corporate profits in history, and his final annual salary was $400 million. His successor, Rex Tillerson, signed a $500 billion deal to explore for oil in the rapidly thawing Russian Arctic, and in 2012 was awarded the Russian Order of Friendship. In 2016, Tillerson, at his last shareholder meeting before he briefly joined the Trump administration as Secretary of State, said, quote, "The world is going to have to continue using fossil fuels whether they like it or not," close quote. It's by no means clear whether Exxon's deception and obfuscation are illegal. The company has long maintained that it, quote, "has tracked the scientific consensus on climate change, and its research on the issue has been published in publicly available peer-reviewed journals," close quote. The First Amendment preserves one's right to lie, although in October, New York State Attorney General Barbara D. Underwood filed suit against Exxon for lying to investors, which is a crime. What is certain is that the industry's campaign cost us the efforts of the human generation that might have made the crucial difference in the climate fight. Exxon's behavior is shocking, but not entirely surprising. Philip Morris lied about the effects of cigarette smoking before the government stood up to big tobacco. The mystery that historians will have to unravel is what went so wrong in our governance and our culture that we have done essentially nothing to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. There are undoubtedly myriad intellectual, psychological, and political sources for our inaction, but I cannot help thinking that the influence of Ayn Rand, the Russian émigré novelist, may have played a role. Rand's disquisitions on the virtue of selfishness and unbridled capitalism are admired by many American politicians and economists, Paul Ryan, Tillerson, Mike Pompeo, Andrew Puzder, and Donald Trump among them. Trump, who has called The Fountainhead his favorite book, said that the novel, quote, "relates to business and beauty and life and inner emotions. That book relates to everything," close quote. Long after Rand's death in 1982, the libertarian gospel of the novel continues to sway our politics. Government is bad. Solidarity is a trap. Taxes are theft. The Koch brothers, whose enormous fortune derives in large part from the mining and refining of oil and gas, have peddled a similar message, broadening the efforts that Exxon-funded groups like the Global Climate Coalition, the GCC he referred to earlier, spearheaded in the late 1980s. Fossil fuel companies and electric utilities, often led by Koch-linked groups, have put up fierce resistance to change. In Kansas, Koch allies helped turn mandated targets for renewable energy into voluntary commitments. In Wisconsin, Scott Walker's administration prohibited state land officials from talking about climate change. In North Carolina, the state legislature, in conjunction with real estate interests, effectively banned policymakers from using scientific estimates of sea level rise in the coastal planning process because they're wanting to sell condos. We're talking about rampant overdevelopment in the face of the water coming. Whew, this one is a tough one, folks. I'm going to read that last sentence again. In North Carolina, the state legislature, in conjunction with real estate interests, effectively banned policymakers from using scientific estimates of sea level rise in the coastal planning process. Earlier this year, Americans for Prosperity, the most important Koch front group, waged a campaign against new bus routes and light rail service in Tennessee, invoking human liberty. Quote, if someone has the freedom to go where they want, do what they want, they're not going to choose public transit, a spokeswoman for the group explained. In Florida, an anti-renewable subsidy ballot measure invoked the rights of electricity consumers regarding solar energy choice. Such efforts help explain why, in 2017, the growth of American residential solar installations came to a halt, even before March 2018, when President Trump imposed a 30% tariff on solar panels, and why the number of solar jobs fell in the U.S. for the first time since the industry's great expansion began a decade earlier. In February, at the Department of Energy, Rick Perry, who once skipped his own arraignment on 2 felony charges, which were eventually dismissed in order to attend a Koch brothers event, issued a new projection in which he announced that the U.S. would go on emitting carbon at current levels through 2050. This means that our nation would use up all the planet's remaining carbon budget if we plan on meeting the 1.5 degree target. Skepticism about the scientific consensus, Perry told the media in 2017, is a sign of a wise, intellectually engaged person. Close quote. Of all the environmental reversals made by the Trump administration, the most devastating was its decision last year to withdraw from the Paris Accords, making the U.S. the largest single historical source of carbon, the only nation not engaged in international efforts to control it. As the Washington Post reported, the withdrawal was the result of a collaborative venture. Among the anti-government ideologues and fossil fuel lobbyists responsible was Myron Ebell, who was at Trump's side in the Rose Garden during the withdrawal announcement, and who at Frontiers of Freedom had helped run a complex influence campaign in support of the tobacco industry. Ebell is a director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which was founded in 1984 to advance, quote, the principles of limited government, free enterprise, and individual liberty, close quote, and which funds the Cooler Heads Coalition, an informal and ad hoc group focused on dispelling the myths of global warming, of which Ebell is the chairman. Also instrumental were the Heartland Institute and the Koch brothers' Americans for Prosperity. After Trump's election, these groups sent a letter reminding him of his campaign pledge to pull America out. He's talking about Paris. The CEI ran a TV spot. Quote, Mr. President, don't listen to the swamp. Keep your promise. And despite the objections of most of his advisors, he did. The coalition had used its power to slow us down precisely at the moment when we needed to speed up. As a result, the particular politics of one country for 1/2 century will have changed the geological history of the Earth. We are on a path to self-destruction, and yet there is nothing inevitable about our fate. Solar panels and wind turbines are now among the least expensive ways to produce energy. Storage batteries are cheaper and more efficient than ever. We could move quickly if we chose to, but we'd need to opt for solidarity and coordination on a global scale. The chances of that look slim. In Russia, the second largest petrostate after the US, Vladimir Putin believes that, quote, climate change could be tied to some global cycles on Earth or even of planetary significance, close quote. Saudi Arabia, the third largest petrostate, tried to water down the recent IPCC report. Jair Bolsonaro, the newly elected president of Brazil, has vowed to institute policies that would dramatically accelerate the deforestation of the Amazon, the world's largest rainforest. Meanwhile, Exxon recently announced a plan to spend $1 million, about 1/100th of what the company spends each month in search of new oil and gas, to back the fight for a carbon tax of $40 a ton. At a press conference, some of the IPCC's authors laughed out loud at the idea that such a tax would, this late in the game, have sufficient impact. The possibility of swift change lies in people coming together in movements large enough to shift the zeitgeist. In recent years, despairing at the slow progress, I've been one of many to protest pipelines and to call attention to big oil's deceptions. The movement is growing. Since 2015, when 400,000 people marched in the streets of New York before the Paris climate talks, activists, often led by indigenous groups and communities living on the front lines of climate change, have blocked pipelines, forced the cancellation of new coal mines, helped keep the major oil companies out of the American Arctic, and persuaded dozens of cities to commit to 100% renewable energy. Each of these efforts has played out in the shadow of the industry's unflagging campaign to maximize profits and prevent change. Voters in Washington state were initially supportive of a measure on last month's ballot which would have imposed the nation's first carbon tax, a modest fee that won support from such figures as Bill Gates, but the major oil companies spent record sums to defeat it. In Colorado, a similarly modest referendum that would have forced frackers to move their rigs away from houses and schools went down after the oil industry outspent citizen groups 40-1. This fall, California's legislators committed to using only renewable energy by 2045, which was a great victory in the world's fifth largest economy, but the governor refused to stop signing new permits for oil wells, even in the middle of the state's largest cities, where asthma rates are high. New kinds of activism keep springing up. In Sweden, this fall, a one-person school boycott by a 15-year-old girl named Greta Thunberg helped galvanize attention across Scandinavia. At the end of October, a new British group, Extinction Rebellion, its name both a reflection of the dire science and a potentially feisty response, announced plans for a campaign of civil disobedience. Last week, 51 young people were arrested in Nancy Pelosi's office for staging a sit-in demanding that the Democrats embrace a Green New Deal that would address the global climate crisis with policies to create jobs in renewable energy. They may have picked a winning issue. Several polls have shown that even Republicans favor more government support for solar panels. This battle is epic and undecided. If we miss the 2-degree target, we will fight to prevent a rise of 3 degrees, and then 4. It's a long escalator down to hell. Last June, I went to Cape Canaveral to watch Elon Musk's Falcon 9 rocket lift off. When the moment came, it was as I'd always imagined. The clouds of steam venting in the minutes before launch, the immensely bright column of flame erupting with remarkable slowness, the rocket began to rise, the grip of gravity yielding to the force of its engines. It's the most awesome technological spectacle human beings have produced. Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson are among the billionaires who have spent some of their fortunes on space travel, a last-ditch effort to expand the human zone of habitability. In November 2016, Stephen Hawking gave humanity a deadline of 1,000 years to leave Earth. 6 months later, he revised the timetable to a century. In June 2017, he told an audience that, quote, spreading out may be the only thing that saves us from ourselves. He continued, Earth is under threat from so many areas that it is difficult for me to be positive. He was, of course, dying at the time, folks. Let's be realistic. Close quote. That's me, the little editorial bit there. But escaping the wreckage is almost certainly a fantasy. Even if astronauts did cross the 34 million miles to Mars, they'd need to go underground to survive there. To what end? The multi-million-dollar attempts to building a biosphere in the southwestern desert in 1991 ended in abject failure. Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of a trilogy of novels about the colonization of Mars, recently called such projects a moral hazard. People think if we fuck up here on Earth, we can always go to Mars or the stars, he said. It's pernicious. The dream of interplanetary colonization also distracts us from acknowledging the unbearable beauty of the planet we already inhabit. The day before the launch, I went on a tour of the vast grounds of the Kennedy Space Center with NASA's public affairs officer, Greg Harland, and the biologist, Don Dankert. I'd been warned beforehand by other NASA officials not to broach the topic of global warming. In any event, NASA's predicament became obvious as soon as we climbed up on a dune overlooking Launch Complex 39, from which the Apollo missions left for the moon, and where any future Mars missions would likely begin. The launch pad is a quarter of a mile from the ocean, a perfect location in the sense that if something goes wrong, the rockets will fall into the sea, but not so perfect, since that sea is now rising. NASA started worrying about this sometime after the turn of the century, and formed a dune vulnerability team. In 2011, Hurricane Sandy, even at a distance of a couple of 100 miles, churned up waves strong enough to break through the barrier of dunes along the Atlantic shoreline of the Space Center and very nearly swamped the launch complexes. Dankert had millions of cubic yards of sand excavated from a nearby Air Force base and saw to it that 180,000 native shrubs were planted to hold the sand in place. So far, the new dunes have yielded little ground to storms and hurricanes. But what impressed me more than the dunes was the men's deep appreciation for their landscape. Kennedy Space Center shares a real estate with the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, Harlan said. We use less than 10% for our industrial purposes. When you look at the beach, it's like 1870s Florida, the longest undisturbed stretch on the Atlantic coast, Dankert said. We launch people into space from the middle of a wildlife refuge. That's amazing, close quote. The two men talked for a long time about their favorite local species, the brown pelicans that were skimming the ocean, the Florida scrub jays. While rebuilding the dunes, they carefully bucket-trapped and relocated dozens of gopher tortoises. Before I left, they drove me half an hour across the swamp to a pond near the Space Center's headquarters building just to show me some alligators. Menacing snouts were visible beneath the water, but I was more interested in the sign that had been posted at each corner of the pond, explaining that the alligators were native species, not pets. Quote, putting any food in the water for any reason will cause them to become accustomed to people and possibly dangerous. It went on, adding that if that should happen, they must be removed and destroyed, close quote. Something about the sign moved me tremendously. It would have been easy enough to poison the pond, just as it would have been easy enough to bulldoze the dunes without a thought for the tortoises. But NASA hadn't done so, because of a long series of laws that draw on an emerging understanding of who we are. In 1867, John Muir, one of the first Western environmentalists... Let me start that sentence again. In 1867, John Muir, one of the first Western environmentalists, walked from Louisville, Kentucky to Florida, a trip that inspired his first heretical thoughts about the meaning of being human. Quote, the world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all the facts, Muir wrote in his diary. A numerous class of men are painfully astonished whenever they find anything, living or dead, in all God's universe, which they cannot eat or render in some way that they call useful to themselves. Close quote. Muir's proof that this self-centeredness was misguided was the alligator, which he could hear roaring in the Florida swamp as he camped nearby, and which clearly caused man mostly trouble. But these animals were wonderful nonetheless. Muir decided remarkable creatures perfectly adapted to their landscape. Quote, I have better thoughts of those alligators now that I've seen them at home, he wrote. In his diary, he addressed the creatures directly. Quote, honorable representatives of the great saurian of an older creation, may you long enjoy your lilies and rushes, and be blessed now and then with a mouthful of terror-stricken man by way of dainty. Close quote. That evening, Harland and Dankert drew a crude map to help me find the beach north of Patrick Air Force Base, and south of the spot where, in 1965, Barbara Eden emerged from her bottle to greet her astronaut at the start of the TV series, I Dream of Jeannie. There, they said, I could wait out the hours until the pre-dawn rocket launch and perhaps spot a loggerhead sea turtle coming ashore to lay her eggs. And so I sat on the sand. The beach was deserted, and under a near full moon I watched as a turtle trundled from the sea and lumbered deliberately to a spot near the dune, where she used her powerful legs to excavate a pit. She spent an hour laying eggs, and even from 30 yards away you could hear her heavy breathing in between the whispers of the waves. And then, having covered her clutch, she tracked back to the ocean, in the fashion of others like her, for the past 120 million years. Life on a Shrinking Planet by Bill McKibben. This has been the Anticlimactic Non-Show with your host,